Captain Zal and his crew of elite alien mercenaries were famous for their impeccable record in completing risky missions throughout the galaxy. Highly skilled and equipped with the latest technology, they had no equal in the world of interstellar contracts. Their ship, a sleek and state-of-the-art vessel, was their pride, a marvel of engineering built for speed, power, and stealth. They had previously escaped tough situations, always relying on their ship and its advanced systems to either outrun or outfight any danger. However, this time, everything had gone terribly wrong. A failed mission had them fleeing from a powerful interstellar syndicate, their ship sustaining severe damage. The Starship's flawless systems began malfunctioning, one after another, with warning lights blinking ominously across the control panels. The power core sputtered, and the engine struggled to keep the ship moving through the cold void of space. The seasoned crew, battle-hardened over the years, began to feel the creeping onset of panic. This situation was far worse than any they had ever encountered. The ship's onboard AI couldn't identify the issue, and none of the advanced repair systems seemed to be working. Captain Zal paced the bridge, his eyes glued to the flickering screens, while his crew of 6, each from a different species, exchanged worried glances. Zal's second-in-command, Morak, a hulking brute, growled in frustration and slammed his fist into the wall. They all understood the gravity of the situation. If they didn't fix the ship soon, they would be dead in space, stranded, with their enemies closing in. Suddenly, the navigation console pinged, indicating the presence of a nearby planet. Zal moved swiftly to check the readout, his heart sinking when he saw the details. It was an uncharted world, home to humans, an insignificant species in the galaxy's grand scheme. The planet was known for being technologically backward, essentially a dumping ground for obsolete machinery and wrecked starships. It was the last place any respectable mercenary wanted to land. Zal glanced at his crew, knowing they shared his disdain, but they had no other choice. With a heavy sigh, Zal ordered the ship to make an emergency descent to the planet. The ship groaned under the strain, its engines barely holding together as they descended into the atmosphere, flames streaking across the hull. The mercenaries strapped in, bracing for impact as the ship buckled and shook violently, finally crashing into a massive scrapyard with a deafening roar. Metal crunched and sparks flew as the ship skidded to a stop, half buried in a pile of rusted machinery and broken-down starships. As the dust settled, the mercenaries unstrapped themselves, stumbling out into the wreckage-strewn wasteland. They were met with a bleak sight: mountains of scrap metal, old Earth vehicles, and parts from long-abandoned starships stretched as far as the eye could see. The place reeked of oil, rust, and decay. It was clear this planet was a graveyard for technology nobody wanted anymore. Zal surveyed the area, frustration boiling inside him. This was not how things were supposed to go. The planet was a technological backwater, and the thought of repairing their state-of-the-art ship with the junk littering the scrapyard seemed laughable. His crew muttered their dissatisfaction, each knowing that finding a way off this planet would be next to impossible. As they stood assessing their grim situation, a figure appeared in the distance, slowly walking towards them. It was a human, an older man dressed in greasy overalls, carrying a small toolbox that looked as old as the scrapyard itself. His face was lined with age, his hair graying, and his hands calloused from years of work. This was Joe, the scrapyard's caretaker, though he looked like a relic himself. He approached the aliens without fear, wiping his hands on a dirty rag as he squinted at their broken ship. Joe didn't say much. He had seen plenty of ships crash here before, and it wasn't the first time an alien craft had ended up in his scrapyard. He walked over to Captain Zal and his crew, taking in the scene with an unhurried calm. The mercenaries, still dazed from the crash, watched him approach, unsure of what to make of this human. They had little respect for humans, and this old man with his basic tools and primitive surroundings only reinforced their low opinion of the species. Morak, ever impatient, snorted in disdain as Joe came closer. "You think this human can fix our ship?" he sneered, looking at Zal. The rest of the crew laughed bitterly, certain that their chances of escaping this forsaken planet had just dropped to zero. Joe glanced at the group and then at the broken-down starship, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stepped forward to get a better look. Without a word, he ran a hand over the ship's hull, feeling the damage beneath his fingers. It was clear this wasn't Joe's first time encountering advanced alien tech. He nodded to himself as if mentally taking stock of what needed to be done. The aliens exchanged skeptical glances, finding it absurd that this man, armed only with a few worn-out tools, could comprehend anything about their ship, let alone fix it. Zal remained silent, his mind racing. He knew they had no other options. Their systems were fried, their enemies likely on their trail, and there was no advanced tech on this planet to assist them. The sooner the ship was repaired, the better, no matter how improbable it seemed. Joe, still quietly assessing the situation, finally spoke. "I can get her up and running," he said in a gravelly voice. His words were simple, without bravado, but they carried a weight of confidence that surprised the crew. He didn't ask for explanations or try to impress them with technical jargon. He simply knew what needed to be done. The mercenaries weren't sure whether to laugh or roll their eyes. They had seen the most advanced tech in the galaxy, and here was a human with nothing but a toolbox and a scrapyard, claiming he could fix their ship. Yet they were stranded, and despite their doubts, there was something about Joe's calm demeanor that gave them pause. Zal, always pragmatic, gave a slight nod. "You've got one chance," he said coldly. "But if you can't fix it, we're out of here." With or without your help, Joe didn't respond with words. He simply walked over to his toolbox and opened it, pulling out a few tools that looked as old as the planet itself. He began inspecting the ship more closely, paying no mind to the alien crew's derisive comments. As he worked, the mercenaries watched with growing curiosity. There was something about Joe's movements, slow but deliberate, confident yet unhurried, that made them wonder if perhaps he knew more than they were giving him credit for. As Joe delved deeper into his inspection, the atmosphere among the mercenaries shifted slightly. What had begun as outright contempt began to waver. The old mechanic wasn't fazed by their cutting-edge tech, and more importantly, he quickly identified the real issue, something their advanced diagnostic systems had entirely missed. "Your coolant system's fried," Joe said after a few minutes, tapping the engine compartment's side. "Looks like it's clogged. Too much pressure's built up. That's why your power core's failing. It's overheating and tripping the safety systems." The mercenaries fell silent. Joe's explanation was almost too simple. Surely their advanced diagnostics would have detected such an issue. Zal, keeping his tone measured, asked, "And why didn't our system detect that?" Joe didn't look up as he continued working. "Because your system's built to look for faults within its own parameters. It's not designed to think outside the box. You're using high-tech coolant that can't handle the environment here. Your ship's been running too hot for too long." It was the first time the mercenaries paused to consider that their ship, as advanced as it was, might not be perfect. The aliens exchanged uneasy glances, some now watching Joe more closely. He moved with quiet confidence, as though he understood machines on a fundamental level, whether they were from Earth or the far reaches of the galaxy. There was no awe or surprise in his actions. He simply knew how things worked. Joe finally stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "I can fix it," he said simply, "but it's going to take time. I'll need to patch up the coolant lines, stabilize the pressure, and find something more durable than what you've got in there. Luckily, I've got parts lying around here that'll do the job." The mercenaries stared at him, unsure whether to be impressed or offended. They were used to engineers who relied on sophisticated tools, not a man scavenging in a scrapyard. Marak, still skeptical, growled. "And you think you can fix all that with this?" He waved dismissively at the surrounding junk. Joe shrugged. "I've been working on machines like these, well, not exactly like these, but close enough, since before most of you were born. Machines are machines. They all break down eventually, and they all get fixed the same way, one part at a time." Joe's simple words hung in the air. It wasn't arrogance, nor a boast, it was just fact. He had seen a lot of machines, from cars to spacecraft, and he understood how they worked. The aliens, however, were struggling to reconcile their preconceived notions of human inferiority with what they were witnessing. This old man, armed only with a toolbox and decades of experience, was diagnosing problems that their cutting-edge tech had failed to detect. Captain Zal stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You're saying you can fix the core, stabilize the system, and get us off this planet?" Joe met his gaze. "That's what I'm saying." A long silence followed as Zal weighed his options. He didn't like the situation, nor did he like relying on a human, but they had no choice. Their ship was grounded, and no amount of pride or advanced technology would get them out of this mess. Zal gave a slow nod. "Do what you need to do." The crew exchanged glances, their doubts lingering, but for the first time, a glimmer of hope appeared. Unaffected by their judgment, Joe got to work. He disappeared into the scrapyard for a few minutes, returning with a handful of seemingly mismatched parts. To the aliens, it looked like junk, bits of old Earth tech long discarded, but to Joe, it was exactly what he needed. As he began assembling the makeshift parts, the mercenaries watched in disbelief. His tools were simple screwdrivers, wrenches, and a welding torch, but he wielded them with expert precision. Every movement was deliberate, every adjustment fine-tuned. Joe didn't need fancy diagnostics or automated repair systems. He had something more valuable: intuition, honed by years of fixing things by hand. Machines spoke to him in a way they didn't to most people, and he knew exactly what they needed to keep running. Joe didn't speak much as he worked. The only sounds were the occasional hum of the welding torch or the click of a tool being adjusted. Meanwhile, the mercenaries, though still skeptical, watched with growing curiosity. They had encountered humans like Joe before on other planets, people who made do with what they had, living in the shadow of more advanced species. But there was something different about this one. Joe wasn't trying to impress them. He wasn't awed by their technology or intimidated by the complexity of their ship. He was simply doing his job, and somehow it was working. Bit by bit, Joe explained what he was doing in simple terms. He wasn't showing off, he just understood that even the most advanced technology needed the basics to function. It didn't matter how high-tech a ship was, if the coolant was clogged or the power system overheated, it would fail. And that's where Joe thrived, fixing what others overlooked. Joe wasted no time. As soon as he finished explaining the repairs, he dove right into the work. His tools, ancient by the mercenary standards, were simple hand instruments that hadn't been used in most parts of the galaxy for centuries. His materials were no better rusted parts salvaged from Earth's technological graveyard. But none of that seemed to matter. The old mechanic worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been fixing machines for a lifetime. His movements were precise, almost instinctive, as he welded, wired, and calibrated the Starship's intricate systems by hand. Captain Zal's crew stood back, struggling to believe what they were seeing. Their advanced Starship, a marvel of cutting-edge technology, was being repaired with tools that looked like they belonged in a museum. The coolant lines, which had catastrophically failed, were patched with materials Joe scavenged from the wreckage. What baffled the mercenaries most was how seamlessly Joe bridged the gap between their complex alien tech and his outdated Earth tools. It wasn't supposed to be possible. There were rules to how machines worked, rules they had been taught since they first studied engineering. But Joe ignored those rules. He made things fit together where they shouldn't, repurposing broken components and manually adjusting systems where their advanced diagnostics had failed. "There's no way this works," muttered one of the crew members, watching as Joe spliced a set of wires together with an almost unnatural confidence. But despite their disbelief, the mercenaries couldn't deny what was happening before them. Joe wasn't just fixing the Starship, he was making it better. The old mechanic found weak spots in the ship's design that the aliens hadn't even noticed, reinforcing areas with salvage parts and rerouting power systems to increase efficiency. His understanding of machines wasn't just technical, it was instinctive. He could look at a problem and immediately see a solution, even if it meant bending conventional methods. Joe never paused to check a manual or rely on diagnostics. He simply knew what needed to be done. For the mercenaries, it was a revelation. They had always relied on technology to think for them. When a system failed, they replaced it or ran a diagnostic. Joe didn't have that luxury, and it was becoming clear that his ingenuity came from years of hands-on experience, fixing things others would have discarded as unsalvageable. To Joe, every machine, no matter how advanced or outdated, was just a collection of parts, and parts, no matter where they came from, could always be made to work together with enough creativity. As Joe continued his work, the mercenaries found themselves slowly gravitating towards him, watching with disbelief and curiosity. They came from a society where technology had advanced so far that most people no longer understood how it worked at a fundamental level. They knew how to operate it, but not how to fix it. Yet here was a human using nothing but his hands, scrap metal, and a few basic tools, bringing their ship back to life. Joe didn't stop to explain his process in detail, he didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. The first breakthrough came when he rerouted the power core, stabilizing the overheating problem that had crippled their systems. When the core's hum steadied into a smooth rhythm, the aliens couldn't hide their shock. They had expected hours or even days of waiting, unsure if this human could do anything at all. Yet here they were, less than an hour in, and Joe had already restored power to the ship. "Impossible," muttered Morak, the largest of the crew, staring at the readouts on his datapad. But it wasn't impossible, it was happening right before their eyes. Joe moved on, tackling one system after another. The coolant lines, which had seemed like an insurmountable problem just a short time ago, were quickly patched with parts Joe had scavenged from the surrounding wreckage. His modifications were simple, but they worked, bypassing the damaged areas and reinforcing vulnerable spots. It wasn't just the mechanical repairs that impressed the mercenaries, it was Joe's approach. He didn't panic or complain about the state of their technology. He didn't treat the ship with awe or reverence like others might. To Joe, it was just another machine. another puzzle to solve, and he wasn't about to let its complexity stand in the way of fixing what was broken. Bit by bit, the ship came back to life. Systems that had been offline for hours powered on. Lights flickered. The navigation system rebooted. The engine, which had been dead, rumbled back to life. The mercenaries watched in stunned silence as their once broken ship was restored not by advanced tools or cutting-edge tech, but by an old man with a wrench and some spare parts. Captain Zal, the most skeptical of them all, couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for Joe as the mechanic finished up. Zal had prepared for failure, expecting an explanation that human tools weren't enough to fix their ship. Instead, he watched as Joe completed the repairs, standing up and dusting his hands like it was the most routine job in the world. One by one, the ship's systems returned to full power. The core was stabilized, the engines roared to life, and the mercenaries who had mocked Joe and his tools were left speechless. The repairs hadn't just been completed, they had been done better than they could have imagined. The ship's performance was sharper, its systems more stable, and the problems that had plagued it were gone. Joe had taken the time to look at the ship as a machine, not just as an advanced piece of technology. A moment of silence followed as Joe packed up his toolbox, the mercenaries still processing what they had just witnessed. What they had considered impossible had just been achieved not with their advanced tech, but with human ingenuity, creativity, and hands-on expertise. They couldn't deny it anymore. Joe had done what their sophisticated diagnostics and repair systems couldn't, and in less time than they had expected. Captain Zal exchanged a glance with Morak, both recognizing that they had underestimated the old mechanic. Joe had shown them something they hadn't seen in a long time: the power of hands-on problem-solving, of understanding machines on a fundamental level, and of finding solutions where others only saw problems. It was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. With the repairs complete, Joe stood back, wiping the sweat from his brow. The once battered ship now hummed with life, every system online and functioning. The mercenaries had expected to be stranded for days, maybe even weeks, given the extent of the damage and the complexity of the ship. But in just a few hours, Joe had done the impossible. The Starship, with all its advanced technology, was fully operational. As the last of the systems rebooted, Joe made a few final tweaks to the engine, working with precision that even the mercenaries couldn't deny. He installed a small modification and improvement to the engine's performance beyond its original specifications. It was a simple change, something Joe had thought of while fixing the coolant lines. To the aliens, it was unthinkable that someone without advanced tools or diagnostics could improve their ship, but Joe had done just that. Captain Zal stood at the ship's entrance, watching as Joe finished. He had never imagined that their sophisticated starship could be repaired so quickly, especially by someone relying on tools they had long discarded as obsolete. The fact that the ship wasn't just repaired but improved left him speechless. He exchanged a glance with Morak, who was equally stunned. Joe packed his toolbox, as calm and unhurried as he had been the entire time. For him, this was just another job, another machine that needed fixing. But for the mercenaries, it was a revelation. They had mocked him, dismissed his abilities, and doubted that his primitive methods could ever match their advanced tech. Now they were forced to admit that human mechanics, with their hands-on experience and resourcefulness, could accomplish feats their engineers hadn't even imagined. As Joe stood ready to leave, Captain Zal approached him, awkwardness evident in his movements. Clearly, he was struggling with how to thank someone he had so thoroughly underestimated. For a moment, there was silence, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound in the scrapyard. "You fixed it," Zal said, his voice measured but respectful. Better than it was before. Joe simply nodded. Machines are machines. They all have their quirks, just needed a few adjustments. Morak, who had been the loudest to mock Joe earlier, stepped forward. The towering alien looked down at Joe with something resembling grudging respect. "We thought you were." "Well, we didn't think you could do it," he admitted. "Guess we were wrong." Joe shrugged off the praise. He wasn't the type to make a big deal out of things. For him, the work spoke for itself, but there was no denying the shift in how the mercenaries now saw him. They had arrived on Earth with arrogance, confident in their technological superiority. Now, they were leaving with a newfound respect for human ingenuity and adaptability. Captain Zal extended his hand, a rare gesture from his species. "Thank you," he said, the words careful, as if he was still coming to terms with being in debt to a human. Zhao shook his hand, giving a slight nod in return. "Just doing my job," he replied, turning to pack the rest of his things. The mercenaries boarded their ship, still processing the day's events. As the engines roared and the ship lifted off, they couldn't help but glance back at the scrapyard, at the old man who had done the impossible. For so long, they had believed their advanced technology made them invincible, that it could solve any problem. But Joe had shown them something they had forgotten sometimes. It wasn't the tech that made the difference, it was the hands that worked on it, the creativity from experience, and the ability to find solutions where others saw only failure. As the ship soared into space, Captain Zhao sat in the pilot's seat, reflecting on the day. Joe's quiet confidence had left a lasting impression. It wasn't just about the repairs, it was how Joe had approached the problem. Zhao realized that his society, with all its technological advancements, had lost something along the way. They had become too reliant on their machines, too comfortable letting technology think for them. Joe, with his simple tools and deep understanding of machines, had reminded them of the importance of adaptability and hands-on problem-solving. As the stars stretched before them, Zhao made a mental note to remember the lesson. Human technology might seem primitive, but there was a depth to human ingenuity that couldn't be ignored. They could adapt, fix things, and survive in ways no machine could. Meanwhile, back in the scrapyard, Joe watched the ship disappear into the sky. He stood surrounded by piles of scrap and old machinery, the same place he had worked for decades. To him, today was no different from any other. He had seen starships come and go, some more advanced than others, but all just machines in the end. Joe wasn't one for glory or recognition. The satisfaction of a job well done was enough. He returned to his workshop, the clinking of metal and the smell of oil filling the air. Life in the scrapyard would continue as usual, but while Joe's world remained unchanged, the mercenaries would carry the lesson of his work with them wherever they went. Joe's legacy wasn't one of fame or grand achievements, it was one of quiet resilience and mastery over the simple, the overlooked. His ability to take what others saw as junk and turn it into something functional was a testament to human creativity and adaptability. Advanced technology had its place, but some problems could only be solved by human hands and tools. In that scrapyard on that forgotten planet, Joe had proven that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most powerful of all.